We all know when we hear the Home Secretary say that they're going to work very hard on getting through the backlog of asylum applications. Everybody thinks, oh God, they're going to nod them all through.
Shoplifting to become essentially decriminalised, but if you dare call them scumbags or try to name and shame them, we will come down on you like a ton of bricks. If that's not, law and order in this country right now, I don't know what else is.
To get a British politician to go out and argue for sovereignty and borders mattering is actually hard. You'd be hard pressed, right?
Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, joined in studio as ever by Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And absolutely thrilled to be joined down the line by the director of the Academy of Ideas, Claire Fox.
Hi.
So coming up today, we'll be discussing Starmer's small boats problem, the truth about crime in Britain, and the Trump-Putin summit. This episode of the Spike podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Running a small business can be hugely rewarding, but without the help of a marketing department, graphic designers and accountants, you can sometimes feel like you're on your own and you don't know how to grow. That's where Shopify comes in. Shopify is the commerce platform supporting millions of businesses all over the world, from small brands just getting started to established household names like Mattel and Gymshark. Shopify is who they trust to take their business to the next level. With Shopify, there's no need to learn tricky technical skills like graphic design or coding. Shopify's own design studio comes with hundreds of ready-to-use templates that speak to your brand from the start. If you need a snappy headline or sales pitch, Shopify's handy AI tools can generate polished content for your business at the touch of a button. It can even help you build social media campaigns to keep your customers in the loop. You'll feel like you've got a whole team behind you, even if you're the only person in your business. And the best part yet, Shopify offers world-class expertise on everything from supply chain management to international shipping. Whatever your business's needs are, you can rest easy in the knowledge that Shopify's got your back. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into cash with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your £1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. So Keir Starmer quite famously promised to smash the people trafficking gangs that are responsible for the small boats crisis. Now it's been clear that he's been smashing records in small boats arrivals. 50,000 small boats have arrived, or people have arrived on small boats since he became the Prime Minister. Tom, this is a pretty devastating failure.
Oh no, absolutely. And this is the fastest that this milestone has ever been reached by any Prime Minister. It seems like we're also odds on to best the kind of 2022 calendar year record for small boats arrivals. And given the fact that Keir Starmer has really staked so much claim on smashing the gangs, on trying to diffuse the issue of migration in general, but illegal migration in particular, as he sees reform rise, it's going to obviously go down as a catastrophic failure. And particularly at a time in which migration is becoming the primary issue in not just British politics, but Western politics in many respects. There was a YouGov poll recently, 56% of the population now see it as the primary issue facing the country, with the economy a relatively distant second. When you've got a government which is seen not only to be failing, but almost not to be properly trying or to be pursuing no-hoper, kind of tinkering policies as they have been, then surely this can't be anything but disastrous for them. I mean, even on its own terms, the way in which they try to approach this is, rather than to kind of grasp the nettle of the ECHR, the Refugee Convention, the more kind of structural problems, it makes it very difficult to protect one's own border in the kind of new era of asylum that we live in. It's been a kind of a policing response. So, giving £100 million to the NCA, National Crime Agency, having dedicated officers and so on. Even arrests for people smuggling crimes by the NCA are down by about 16% if memory serves. So on every conceivable measure, this has failed. Oh, we're going to strike all these deals with our partners near and far abroad to try and deal with this. There was a deal in Iraqi Kurdistan trying to deal with this at source. There was the deal with France, the 1 in, 1 out, which has turned out to be 17 in, 1 out. I mean, it's just quite clear that the way in which they're trying to pursue this, which is you strike international agreements and you just kind of beef up your own kind of policing capacity, it's just not working. And I think we're getting to the point now where the public is starting to ask, not without cause, whether or not they even want to solve this problem or just appear to be doing something about it, which is clearly two very different things.
Definitely. And Claire, I mean, people are right to be angry about this issue, aren't they? I mean, there's this kind of line doing the rounds in a lot of the sort of liberal media that Starmer is whipping up fear of the small boats, that this would not be an issue if he didn't bang on about it so much. Almost treating Starmer and Farage as on the same page on this. What do you make of that? And surely this is just an issue that has to be addressed.
I think it's been brewing for so long, and it's just that it's almost like exploded and cut through into politics mainstream now. And that's one of the reasons why the Labour government have been forced to address it, at least rhetorically. I think, by the way, that smashing the gangs was always a wrong-headed notion. I mean, it is like the war on drugs. It's like these are, the people who are behind it, the big figures behind it are proper gangsters, as it were. So that's really hard to get. On the small gangbusters who are getting people on the boats are in another country, so you don't know how to arrest them. You haven't got them here. But the main reason I don't like it is because it puts the focus on other people, and it for a reason that they don't actually want to be seen in any way to be being hostile to the people in the small boats. And I really noticed this in discussions in the Lords around the new Borders Bill, where the minister in charge, Lord Hanson of Flint, was at great pains to stress that, the people in the boats were innocent victims of these gangland, gang runners, if you see what I mean. And so what then happens is that you're meant to straight away have only sympathy and empathy with the people in the small boats. Whereas I think what's happened is the British public have lost that patience with having sympathy and empathy with the people in the small boats. And even though you might be able to imagine a situation of people wanting to improve their lives and doing whatever they can to get into a country where, let's be honest, they're probably going to have a reasonable life, better life than they might have had from elsewhere. That's not to say that they're kind of these pure victims who need our sympathy and our help. And it's precisely that attitude which I think has led to problems in relation to the way human rights law has been applied, the notion that you can't be too hard on them, that they are, the victims who need to be looked after by a welfare system. And of course, these are the pull factors, the very pull factors, which has created a situation where it is an attractive option to get to the UK. I think in addition to what Tom said as well, I think one of the most depressing parts of this is that there is such a thing as seeking asylum that's legitimate. There is such a thing as a refugee status that we might at any time, any of us in different situations need. These are honourable traditions that the West has developed, and they've been completely devalued and promiscuously bastardized by the way that we are told that we're not allowed to challenge these notions. But in fact, the 1951 Refugee Convention is not fit for purpose. We all know when we hear the Home Secretary say that they're going to work very hard on getting through the backlog of asylum applications, everybody thinks, oh God, they're going to nod them all through, right? Because all of the people applying have at this point either been on social media and seen what the influencers say you should say, or they've come across in Calais one of those UK human rights lawyers, or one of those NGOs handing out lists of, if you say this, you'll be all right. Everybody knows that in order to get in, you need to mention certain countries. You need to say your age is a certain age. You need to have a narrative that quite quickly will fit into the poor victim narrative, and will mean that you can get asylum. And that, of course, means that you're effectively offering asylum to the whole world, because anyone can turn up and claim any of these things. And apart from the odd person who has not worked out yet that if you say you're from India, you won't get asylum, and inadvertently wanders in and says, I'm from India, and then they kind of kick them out. Practically, there's another 10, 12 countries where you say, if I'm from this country, that you will be allowed to stay legitimately, which is not going to satisfy perfectly reasonably the anxieties of people in this country who feel that what's happened is a loss of control of the borders and a loss of willingness by the political elite to listen to those concerns from ordinary people who live here.
Yeah, and I think, the public is not unsympathetic to the plight of people who are genuinely in danger. You think about, there are very few complaints about the Ukrainian relocation scheme, hundreds of thousands of people coming over here, fleeing war. You never hear people complain about the Hong Kong settlement scheme, people fleeing CCP tyranny. But there is just a sense that, people are seeing people coming in, staying in a hotel, often largely men. There seems to be a disproportionate criminal element. I think that's fair to say. Illegal migration probably selects for that. If people are willing to break the law in one way, why would they not be willing to break it in other ways? I don't know. What's your feeling on that, Tom?
I mean, that's one sentiment that I detected on some of the anti-hotel protests that we reported on. Was a lot of the people, primarily the women in attendance, incidentally, saying that if this was women and children, this would be a very different situation. We would kit them out with everything that they needed, but this is clearly something different. I also think, as Claire was alluding to there, the way in which this argument has been had out from the sort of nominally pro-asylum side has been so simplistic and so black and white as to what this issue is. So, for instance, referring to all of them as asylum seekers, it's clear that asylum has become a route just for illegal migration.
Yeah.
To some degree, we can argue over to which degree. There was that point during Rishi Sunak's time in office when it became apparent that for a number of weeks or months, 30% of the small boats arrivals were coming from Albania, a place that was not war-torn, and there were not unfounded fears that this was just become a kind of funnel for organised crime.
Yeah,
they got on top of that. They're fleeing war. They are fleeing France. All of these kinds of gaslighting arguments, one after another, or also the tendency to treat them in a kind of almost dehumanising way, as if they're all sort of angels, victims who need support. Quite frankly, all you need is a handful of instances of serious crimes being committed by those who have entered for that entirely to shatter with most people. As I say, it's kind of dehumanising and paternalistic to treat any group of individuals as completely incapable of doing anything wrong. But that's the kind of narrative that has been spun. And I think Claire makes a very important point about, not only has this had a tremendous impact, again, not just illegal migration, but I think it's the keenest example of this where the whole migration debate is concerned. It's an issue on which people feel like not only does it, the way in which it's being handled, grate against what they've clearly expressed at the ballot box on demonstrations, what parties they've voted for and so on, but also that it just seems to grate against simple common sense. This is clearly not a sustainable situation. This is clearly in some respect not a, it's a non-negligible risk to the communities that have to bear the brunt of it because of a lot of the cases that we've seen recently. Another resident of the Epping Hotel recently being brought up on sexual assault charges. This is, again, something which people can see through the very simplistic lines that are being delivered to them. And on the point of asylum, if the people who see themselves as pro-asylum, as wanting to kind of stand in the tradition of what the Refugee Convention, the ECHR, represents, if they carry on down this road, they're going to destroy any faith in the system full stop for quite a long time. It really needs to be rescued from the mess in which it currently exists. And what's becoming abundantly clear is if you do not have control over your own borders, democratic support for whatever asylum scheme or system that you're presiding over, and it is seen to being managed, safe, proportionate and so on, then there is not going to be any public buy-in. And any public buy-in that already does exist is going to continue to corrode. So people on the pro-asylum side of the argument, which is a noble tradition in the way in which Claire sketched out there, need to take this very seriously. If for no other reason, then you could lose a lot more ground if this continues to carry on the way that it is.
Definitely. And Claire, before we move on, just wanted to talk a bit about the protests. Naturally, they've been characterised as far-right, white supremacist, or all of that kind of thing. But it has been notable how many women are involved. You sort of see seas of pink at a lot of these demos. How many people are just genuinely local, how organic these things have sprung up. What have you made of that reaction?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting. I think it's been much harder, actually, for that idea of them being, the far-right fash to have really taken hold, especially when the Antifa crowd, the alleged anti-racists who talk about, sullying an honourable tradition, it has to be that shower, marching in from outside, asserting that they are the good guys, screaming at local people who are worried about what's happening in their local towns, screaming and abusing them. And then they're supposed to be the angels that we're all meant to celebrate. It's outrageous, isn't it? But it's actually therefore not landed in quite the same way. I mean, in terms of the public discussion, there's a little less enthusiasm for just saying that they're all Nazis, although it still goes on. It just relates to what we were just talking about. I think the Epping protests and the Pink Ladies there have summed up something of a slightly different mood, because in the Epping hotel issue, the asylum hotel, actually the hotel had families in there, asylum families, with women and children as well as men, and there wasn't protests. The protest started when it became, this crowd of unaccompanied, or nobody knows who they are, young men. And that was what really worried people. So I think it just fits in with what we were previously talking about, which is that local people they're not saying anyone who ever turns up is a stranger in our town, we're going to drive out like some medieval, backward masses, right? They're concerned perfectly reasonably at the way that undocumented and sometimes quite, intimidating gangs of young men are hanging around their town and nobody knows who they are. And the state doesn't know who they are. That's the reality of this situation. And the state has lost all control of this situation, even to the point where the people who are on legal visas who came into the country, the Home Office then admit, we didn't bother to check whether they left at the end of their visa. So you've basically got whole swathes of the UK in which there is a perfectly reasonable assessment that people are here and we're not sure about them anymore. We don't know if they're legal. We don't know what their backgrounds are. So I think it's been quite organic, as Tom said. The only thing is, I don't want to be naive. Of course, there will be, some bad faith, what I might traditionally call the far right. There has been a bit of a rise of some of the ethno-nationalists, some of the people who are just like anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant, come what may, no matter what circumstance. And they'll hang on the coattails of these demonstrations, no doubt about it. They'll hang around. But that is a very small, peripheral group of people who, if anything, need local action in order for anyone to take any notice of them, because they're not really getting very far. And it's genuine, I think, both fear, but not just fear. I think a sense of injustice. I saw some interviews the other day with people pointing out that you can't get a dentist appointment in the local area for 2 years or something. It's almost impossible to get a doctor's appointment. And then they'd found out that both dentists and doctor's appointments were available to people in the hotels. And you can just imagine, they just feel bitter. Another pointed out, and perfectly reasonably as well, that during lockdown, the hotels were used to eradicate homelessness almost overnight. And it might not be the right use of hotels, but it had been used. They had been used in that way. Now homelessness is back with a vengeance, and so you've got lots of people who are homeless, who are people who just have fallen on hard times in many ways, and the hotels are full of people who by rights shouldn't be there. And I think, Tom, but I think you wrote an article on this. For all these people who say, in relation to the protests, why are they focusing on sexual assaults and criminality of people in the hotels? But the point about it is, and when there's more sexual assaults by, indigenous white English than there is by would-be asylum seekers and so on and so forth. But the point about it is that they're not meant to be in the country. So every time there is a sexual assault on a young person, on a kid, on a child, on a young woman, by people who have illegally are in the country, but the state are looking after them, I think that people's sense of injustice and fury is actually perfectly justified. They just go, well, yeah, it's bad enough having to deal with our own homegrown sex criminals. Thank you very much. We don't need to have got any more. And it doesn't have to be that everybody in the hotel is a sex criminal. Of course, that wouldn't be true. But the point is that you're exposing people nonetheless to people who nobody has a clue what the circumstances are for their arrival. And we do know that some of them will have got on those boats because they're fleeing and escaping the fact that they've committed crimes in other countries. And they see the UK as an easy touch.
So let's talk about crime. There seems to be a raging debate online. I think a lot of people talking past each other where, you look at one side and they say that everything is fine. The UK has never been better, never been safer. London, in particular, is thriving. And on the other side, we've sort of descended into a kind of dystopian hellhole where you can't leave your house without being attacked or mugged. Claire, I mean, what do you make of this discussion? I mean, there are some trends that you can pick out in some ways. It's true that homicide has gone down in the past year and gone down over the past 10 years. But clearly there are other crimes like shoplifting that are soaring and reaching record heights. Do you think it's the sort of visible stuff that people are seeing, you know, things like shoplifting, things that force us to change our habits are really sticking in the craw and making people angry?
Look, it's perfectly reasonable for Fraser Nelson to point out crime statistics and to say, I'm going to bring a bit of factual information to this debate. This is what he did when he wrote his big essay that caused quite a furore in the Times at the weekend, and to say crime is actually not getting worse. But for him then to say, I would argue, which he did on the radio, to say it's never been, you know, a better time to be in, you know, alive, you know, this is just a kind of made up populist kind of hyperbole, means that he just doesn't get out enough. The truth of the matter is that what people's reactions to this is not that there's people being murdered on every street corner, but that we live in a period of intense incivility, if you want. So the reason why Robert Jenrick's, gonzo journalism when he went around the tube stations and so on actually had some impact and went viral, you know, millions and millions of people watching it, and said, yes, it drives me mad too, is because anyone who lives in London has gone to the tube station and been pushed past by a group of lads who push their way through. And you do feel a bit of a mug as you kind of like pay your money for your Oyster card, right? You think, what's that about? You go into the local Tesco or Aldi or whatever, and there are people just openly filling carrier bags and walking out. And you kind of like, you're standing in the queue to pay, and then you kind of go into the security guard. Have you seen that? And they're kind of going, what can we do, mate? What can we do? You know, so and that doesn't happen all the time, but it happens relatively regularly, I'm afraid to say, in Wood Green, where I'm from. You know, you see it, and you just have this sense that there's that people in authority have thrown their hands up in the air and said, what can we do about it? At the same time that we're all furious that the police are spending their time either, you know, wandering around trying to catch people for pre-crimes by going out jogging and saying, will somebody wolf whistle or catcall these police officers, or trying to prison people for posts they've put online. You just think, God, you know, there are real crimes going on. Could you solve them? But, you know, it's all that kind of... So I think it's at the level of, you know, bikes being smashed up, people feeling that there's no respect, in a way, for law, for rules, that gives the sort of sense of things being out of control. So I don't think that wouldn't necessarily, you know, getting irritated by the fact that people won't put their headphones on the top of the bus and play their music loudly isn't a crime, but it does have an impact on people's perceived notion of what it's like to live somewhere where you just think, God, nobody will... Can't you show a bit of respect, is what they want to say. And so I think all of those people who try and pretend that this is not an issue are not noticing just that the quality of life, due to a sort of growth of an antisocial atmosphere of disrespect for other people and other fellow citizens, and criminality that's not been dealt with, does erode a sort of sense of social solidarity in a really pernicious way, and makes people feel insecure.
Yeah. Yeah, you do sometimes feel like I'm playing by the rules a lot of the time. I actually saw 3 shoplifting incidents in one day in London. And I know that's a bit of a black swan event, you know, that the odds of that are pretty low, but I just can't imagine that 10 years ago.
No, and the kind of phone snatching has become such a, you know, if it hasn't happened to you, you've seen it happen, or it's happened to your friends if you live in London. There is just clear-cut areas in which crime has either been going up, and you can tell people that if you look at it on net, it's not as bad as you think. It's still going up on average, first of all, although seemingly a large part of that is a huge uptick in fraud, as I understand it.
A 31% increase in fraud over the past year. I don't know what that's about, but that is a crime and it is going up.
Absolutely. And, it doesn't do to sort of say, well, it doesn't end the argument to say, well, murders are on the decline. There's obviously areas in which it has been going up. And also, I think another key area is that people feel like there is no consequence when crimes are committed, or even when the kind of more low level, without using too loaded a phrase, kind of antisocial behaviour that we've been talking about is committed. It seems like the police are increasingly incapable of dealing with, say, the phone snatching gangs, that they kind of roll over, that, even if you report a burglary, that's primarily to get a crime number so that you can claim on your insurance. There's not really any assumption that there'll be any genuine investigation. And then also as individuals, less on the crime side, although to a certain extent, but more on the, the just general sort of degradation of courtesy and the public realm that has developed in places like London. Individuals feel increasingly incapable of dealing with that themselves for all kinds of reasons that have been set in train for many years. This more kind of individuated sort of society in which we live, in which people feel increasingly disempowered to try to deal with in the moment things that are irritating or potentially dangerous, not least because I think it's bred of a sense that other people won't back them up. So all of these things taken together, it's going to grate when you hear a kind of slightly more Panglossian intake. You don't have to indulge the slightly more kind of doomerist, London's a complete hellhole, it's kind of irretrievable at this point, which is often kind of, if nothing else, kind of ignorant to the times, other quite difficult times in London's recent history, shall we say, in which a lot of people were leaving as a consequence of a lot of those things. But you don't have to indulge all of that to recognise that some of this is a problem. And on this issue, as in so many others, people feel like they're being gaslit rather than taken seriously. Yeah.
And Tom, before we move on, I mean, we should talk very briefly about the case that sort of sums up the warped priorities of the police. A man in Wrexham put a sign in his window saying, that apologising to customers because they got to put all of these, more valuable, or actually not so valuable items behind security boxes. And he said on the sign, it's because of the scumbags who are shoplifting all the time. And the police paid him a visit, not to help him out with his shoplifting problem, but to chastise him, to tell him that the sign was offensive and potentially provocative. Offensive, presumably, to the shoplifting community.
Yeah, the scumbag community might have been up in arms and protested. I mean, this is such a great example of the warped priorities of the police, isn't it? It's not even treating the symptoms rather than the cause. It's victim blaming. It's telling people off for what they say rather than trying to arrest people for the crimes that they've committed. It sounds like the kind of story that we made up just to have something to talk about. So comical is it? There was another story, wasn't there? I can't remember exactly where it was, where shops were being warned that kind of practice you see from time to time, where they put up pictures, kind of CCTV pictures of people who had stolen from them, or give them a dodgy £10 note or whatever it might be. That might also be legally questionable. I don't know if that's under GDPR or something like that.
Yeah, it came from the Information Commissioner's Office. So it's against GDPR rules to name and shame burglars.
Exactly. So we're not going to investigate the burglaries. We're going to allow shoplifting to become essentially decriminalised. But if you dare call them scumbags or try to name and shame them, we will come down on you like a ton of bricks. If that's not, law and order in this country right now, I don't know what else is.
I've got just a couple of caveats, I suppose. Or one thing is, it's a genuine dilemma about whether one intervenes or not. I mean, on the one hand, you feel that you might, people will say, my mate intervened and got stabbed, or you know what I mean? So you're a bit scared of that. But I do think we had this extraordinary experience the other day of people on the tube who intervened when somebody undressed themselves and was stark naked, and who was obviously very ill, a mentally ill lad did that. But nonetheless, it was very scary for people because, the people who intervened, I think, were arrested by the police. I'm not sure what's happened to them legally, but the fact that they were seen as the problem maybe is in of itself a problem in terms of ordinary citizens acting responsibly. The state doesn't know who the problem is a lot of the time. That's the thing. And so when you hear about people in Bournemouth saying they're going to set up these, squads of people, vigilante squads in a way, kind of go around to check on the Bournemouth beaches and so on, for antisocial behaviour and criminality, I kind of want to cheer it on. On the other hand, I have to say that I slightly did balk at some of the rhetoric that came out of Reform's press conference the other day and subsequent interviews with people like Richard Tyson, which was, we men need to step up and protect our women and children. And I suddenly thought, oh God, found myself back in some Victorian novel, right? I mean, I do understand that with things like the hotels, and there is concern, and as we've seen, about women being potentially assaulted or children being the victims and so on and so forth, that there is an issue there. But I also don't want to get into a situation where we are so frightened that we posit ourselves as women, by the way, as perpetually the victims who need to be looked after and protected. That slightly irritates me as well, because it's a bit like a kind of alt-right feminism version of things, which is that all women need looking after, and we're the weaker version, and you know, all men are potential problems. And obviously there's always a smidgen of truth to these things, but women fought long and hard in order to be not treated as the weaker sex. And so I think we need to get balance here. It's just that I don't think that those liberal commentators who said that this is all populist doom mongering are motivated by that at all. For them, when they're Panglossian, the truth of the matter is that there is now a situation where there's almost like two Englands. They're just two different. I mean, talk about parallel lives. They don't understand what most people's lives are like, and they kind of sit being rather snooty about people's fears and concerns. On the other hand, we should also make sure that we don't become hysterical ourselves. So I suppose there's something like a balance required.
The US President Donald Trump is due to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. That will happen in the evening when this comes out, in order to hash out an end to the Ukraine war. Tom, this is undoubtedly significant, but probably the most notable thing about it, the most notable absence, is that there will be no one from Ukraine there as these two rulers decide, presumably, how territory will be carved up, the terms of the peace.
Absolutely. And I think the kind of great power optics is quite intentional. You have both in Trump and in Putin people who quite value that kind of status placed upon themselves as the kind of great powers deciding what's what. The fact that they're meeting in Alaska is pretty significant. Obviously, it's a US state, US territory, but it was Russian for 150 years as a kind of... And also the fact that it's so far away from the conflict in which it's discussing is kind of telling. I think we'll also see, and by the time people watch this, they'll know a lot more than we currently do, that this meeting wasn't exclusively about Ukraine as well. There'll be about kind of other matters that of interest between the two to be thrashed out there. And obviously it's fundamentally galling because of the fact that Ukraine aren't present. I mean, there's a certain element to this, which is the fact that any kind of peace that is arrived at is going to be incredibly unpalatable for Ukraine, even if many of the people within the Ukrainian political class and even increasingly in the population at large kind of coming to the conclusion, if you look at the polls and if you look at the reporting, that some kind of deeply horrific but unsatisfactory but kind of at this point almost necessary peace needs to be struck is an increasing sentiment you see reported. So in a sense, the absence of Zelensky is kind of useful to him in the sense that this is something that he or people around him might have come to see as inevitable, but it's important that his fingerprints aren't necessarily all over it. What form it takes, again, it's really unclear. It's unclear to see if any genuine peace is going to be successful, not least because it's not absolutely clear where Putin's mind is on this particular question. It seems most likely that if that were to take place, that it's kind of a freezing of the current lines in the war, with Russia having brutally seized 20% of Ukrainian territory. You've got the Russians kind of making these over-the-top claims that they want to, seize the entirety of the oblast, the 4 oblasts that they've formally claimed but don't actually genuinely control. But it seems like what we might end up with is, as Mark Rutte from NATO described it this week, is kind of de facto, if not de jure, recognition of Russia's control, if not legitimate control, over the territory that it's taken. But it's a really grim milestone, and it's a reminder, I think, that there's always been this kind of central paradox at the heart of Ukraine's valiant fight for national survival, for national sovereignty against this imperialistic foe who entered its territory, is that it was always reliant on external support, and that was absolutely necessary. It was completely unavoidable, but it also meant that if you ended up with a change in the political weather, if you ended up with a new administration, and also because of the fact that even though say, Trump's predecessor was much more kind of vocal in his support for Ukraine, there was obviously only so far that Joe Biden was willing to go.
Yeah.
So even though this might be a point that has been coming for some time, not least because of the facts on the ground, the war, Zelensky's increasing domestic political legitimacy problems, increasing collapse in the military manpower and so on, it doesn't sweeten the pill at all for Ukrainians or anyone who just cares for their fight for national sovereignty.
Definitely. And Claire, I mean, there's obviously, the sort of moral dimension of Ukraine being excluded. There's also the sort of geopolitical interest of basically Europe not having any kind of seat at the table. And the most they've been able to do, European leaders, is to sort of try and sway Trump. And you hear these sort of Trump reports about whether they've successfully whispered him into backing Ukraine. It is a bit of an embarrassment for what would have been, part of the world that would have been an important global power.
It's actually really depressing, because following the media on this and trying to follow the way that European leaders have interacted with Trump in relation to this, talk about powerlessness, because, it's all like, I think we've persuaded Trump to understand. It's like this, as you say, it's like Trump whispering. Now, you don't have to be involved in Trump derangement syndrome or be obsessed with getting rid of the Trump government to notice that it's a very precarious situation when you're relying on whether, as Donald Trump himself says, the president himself says, I'll know the first minute I walk in the room what I'm going to do. And it's like, oh, God. And also,
yeah,
his or the inability of the American state to acknowledge properly that this was an entirely illegitimate invasion of a sovereign country in the first instance. The fact that that is just not clearly stated anymore by the Americans does get on my nerves. But I also think that Tom made reference to Biden. I think we've got to be really honest here and say that it was precisely Biden and the European powers who kind of clung on Biden's coattails, because they certainly weren't contributing anything like financially to this, that basically made this a kind of slow drip of not enough support to Ukraine. This could have actually been resolved. I mean, it is quite feasible that earlier on, with the right kind of determination and Western backing, that Russia could have been given a bloody nose. Because even the bravery of the Ukrainian forces at the beginning, and with the kind of support that they could have got but didn't get, could have really kind of been a setback for Putin. But instead, it's dragged on and on and on and on. And now it does mean that, there's internal problems in Ukraine. It means that things are much more unstable. So I'm not trying to just blame Trump at all. Europe might now say, oh, we're prepared to pay now. We are prepared to step up, but only kind of a little bit. And so you're right. They don't feel as though they've got any real say or sway in what the decisive discussion is going to be. And that they're not in the room is indicative of that, I think. And they're having to do Zoom calls earlier on. We've had a Zoom call in which they kind of, it's like a court, isn't it? Where you kind of put forward your, dear Mr. President, we'd like to say on behalf of France or Germany's view on this. You know what I mean? It's like he is very much the dominant figure. I think that says more about Europe than it does about Trump.
No, on the Europe question, I think it really has exposed a lot of the cant and the hypocrisies where Ukraine is concerned. First of all, European leaders and the European Union, they're very good at issuing statements and making tweets and so on. I stand with Ukraine and what have you. But when it comes to actually delivering the kind of support that would allow Ukraine to defend itself, both in this conflict and also in some kind of messy peace that we're potentially going to see in the near future, that was always lacking. There is obviously, even though if the figures will constantly be quoted to you that together the European continent has given more to Ukraine than America has, but they don't have the kind of weaponry that Ukraine actually needs. A lot of that money is just going to kind of paying wages in the Ukrainian government and in the military setup and so on. It's sort of subsidy in many respects. Also, for all of the talk in recent months that we're going to have some sort of coalition of the willing, which is going to support Ukraine regardless of what the Americans do. I mean, first of all, that was always pretty explicitly premised on the fact we would need American support in doing so, perhaps even American air cover. So the idea that this is Europe going alone was never obviously clear. And also the fact that it's been exposed by this war from the very beginning, which is that, many European countries have militaries, which is about 5 blokes in a packet of quavers. I mean, it's been absurd to see people talking in increasingly bellicose terms about Russia in European capitals, whilst being incapable of defending their own borders, where the chips to be down at any point. And even the question of Russian gas and oil. I mean, because of the fact that you've got European countries, because they are so exposed energy-wise, because they have pursued so many disastrous, ruinous net zero policies and so on, continuing to buy Russian gas, not placing any sanctions on these things. You can understand why they're doing it, but at the same time, this is a point that Owen Matthews made in The Spectator recently. Effectively, Europe has put more into the coffers of the Russian war machine than it has Ukraine's over the course of these few years. Now, this is not to say that these aren't countries making difficult decisions in difficult circumstances. The idea that there were going to be an American government or a British government or whatever who would be willing to get into direct conflict with Russia over Ukraine, I think was always for the birds. There's no domestic appetite for that amongst the population as much as anything else. But this has been the story of this conflict, and in the run-up to it as well, is various Western powers in rhetoric and in action kind of essentially kind of, first of all, just writing checks they can't cash, but also some in many cases kind of provoking or prolonging when they have no any interest in actually backing up the kind of claims or threats that they're making at any one point.
Yeah, I just want to very quickly, because I think that one of the things that would have been required, say in the UK, in order to justify increasing expenditure or what have you in that area, would have been a public debate. And of course, like everything else, there hasn't been one. Now, I might be well and truly, 110% on the side of Ukraine and think that they are worth backing. But I'm also aware of the fact that, it's assumed that we all support Ukraine. That's not the same as actually people supporting Ukraine, right? You sometimes have to go out and win an argument. And of course, the argument would be that this is a sovereign state and that sovereignty really matters. A sovereign European state whose sovereignty has been invaded, that borders are the thing. And as Tom says, to get a British politician to go out and argue for sovereignty and borders mattering is actually hard. You'd be hard pressed, right? If you put those kind of arguments, you might be able to convince, ordinary people in this country that this is something worth stepping up for. And by which I mean really putting our money where our mouths are. Instead, what we get is a kind of assumption, a kind of moral righteousness about we're on the right side. We've got to increase the defence budget. And then we've discovered that actually when they do increase the defence budget, probably a lot of it's going to have gone on covering up their Afghan leak cover-up. Did you see what I mean? A lot of the defence budget is going to go, it would appear, on a wide range, that you were talking about the border force or that Quango they've set up in relation to, looks like it might go on that. In other words, it's not clear to me at all that they have been straight with us about what we would need to do in order to support Ukraine. And that's what you would need to do.
Yeah. And just finally, I suppose, to bring it back to Ukraine itself, and if we end up with the beginnings of some kind of messy, intolerable peace at the end of this, it's worth remembering that, of course, it will be intolerable, effectively having to live with 20% of your territory being under the control of an imperialistic aggressor. If you think about the populations already living under that rule there, the tens of thousands of children who've been spirited from Ukraine into Russia, taken away, brainwashed and so on. There's not been any really discussion in going into this Alaska summit about what is going to happen where any of those things are concerned. I suppose, whilst it's not going to be immediately felt by the Ukrainians so ravaged by this war for 3 years, but one thing I think it's worth challenging, the idea that all of this was sort of for nothing. You often get this on the kind of anti-Ukraine side, that they should have just rolled over, essentially, that that's even some of the milder of their critiques. They actually see Ukraine as the kind of villain in the piece, but at worst, or just the kind of unthinking puppet of the West at best. But if you think about just how much they could have lost, if you think about the column of tanks rolling on Kiev, if you think about the amount of territory that in the first months Russia was able to seize before you had those incredible counter-offensives in November 2022, really pushing back the lines, things have been pretty grinding and attritional since then. But precisely that combination of fighting for something that matters, your nation, your family, your friends, with the support and solidarity of the West, yes, but certainly with the ingenuity and spirit of the Ukrainian people themselves, they have given Putin a bloody nose in one way, shape or form. It might not be everything that they want or deserve, but it's been nevertheless a tremendous historic fight that they have mounted for themselves and for precisely the values of nationhood and sovereignty that we all claim to care about.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.